Great. Okay. Thank you all for joining today's Public Campaign Financing Implementation Advisory Committee meeting. Let's do a quick roll call first. So if anyone could just say your name and then whether you are present, that would be really great too.
Corey Chisholm, present.
Becca Urblau, present.
Long Went, present.
Betsy Littlejohn, present.
Marshall McGrady, present.
And Felisa, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Sorry, I'm remote. I just got done in Salem, but I'm here, present.
No problem. All right, great. Thank you all. Well, we have the agenda in front of you, but we have a tight agenda today. We have a lot to get through, and I'm so glad we have quorum. So we'll start with at the request that you all gave us last time, we have a presentation from the County Budget Office about kind of a brief overview of the budget forecast. And thank you all for coming and joining us for that. And then I'll be giving a rundown of a budget breakdown for this program, because this Implementation Advisory Committee will need to make a recommendation about how much funding it will need. So I have some math to run through with you all. And then we'll do a break, and then we'll do a very quick talk about the charter amendment that was passed a couple years ago that has a lot of impact on the work we do here. And then finally, we will talk about methods of distribution, i.e. vouchers versus matching grants versus small donor matching. So we're going to dive in. With that, I would love to turn it over to our esteemed members of the Budget Office. And if you all could just introduce yourself first.
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. Christian Elkin. I'm the county's budget director. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Jeff Renfro. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the county's economist.
So we know we have a tight time frame. We're just going to walk through kind of the general budget process with y'all, and then Jeff's going to talk about the general fund forecast that's impacting our fiscal year 2026 funding that's available, and then kind of just the decision making that's going along with that. It's going to be pretty quick, so I think maybe hold questions to the end, and then we can go through them if that's possible. But if there's just like something you're dying to get out, just raise your hand and we'll stop and ask, let you ask questions. So soon as Daniel gets back, we'll go to the next slide. Sorry to put that pressure on you. One more, please. So why do we do a budget? Well, first of all, it's required by Oregon budget law. But more importantly, the budget is really kind of the biggest and most important policy document that the county produces. And what it does is it takes all the resources that we have available to us, and it basically invests them in the county's priorities and the community's priorities. So if you want to know what a community values, if you look at their budget document, you should be able to tell where those investments are. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the timeline for the budget process. I always say everyone dreads kind of the budget process, but then by the time we get there, everyone says there's not enough time and there's not enough money. But we're going to kind of walk you through what looks like about 7 months of preparation to get to an adopted budget. So in December, actually going back 1 month, in November, Jeff had released our general fund forecast, which basically tells the chair and the commissioners how much money they have to spend. And that's primarily focused on the general fund, because that is our kind of largest pot of funding that's very flexible, and that we get to really focus on the community priorities with that pot of funding. When we get money from the state or the federal government or in grants, it oftentimes is tied to specific services, specific outcomes. When we get money through a taxing voter initiative like the Preschool for All, there's obviously a set of required investments that are part of that. So the general fund is where we really focus when we're talking about where we have the capacity and the most flexibility. And then in December, kind of in that yellow band there is where we are right now. The departments get what we call their general fund allocation this year. If most of you have been reading the newspaper, that general fund allocation came in a constrained resource environment. So basically, we say to the departments, here's everything that you had last year. we're going to inflate it into your current service levels. So we're going to apply the cost of living adjustments, some inflation adjustments, and then we say from there, we need you to apply right this year. Primarily, the chairs asked for 8, 10, and 12% reductions from that general fund amount. And then the departments are really spending a lot of time going through and really looking at the services that they provide, the outcomes that they're trying to achieve, and really focus, where do we need to invest these precious general fund dollars and what can we no longer afford to do? And those things that they can no longer afford to do are going to show up in reductions packages. And I think a lot of times people say, oh, government just takes the budget, inflates it, and then that's your budget for the next year. But that's really not the process that we're going through. So on February 14th, which is Valentine's Day, and Oregon's birthday, we're very excited that it actually landed on this day. I always say it's around Valentine's Day. The departments are going to turn in kind of their first attempt to balance the budget. And they're going to turn that into the budget office, and then we're going to look through it, make sure there's no glaring errors, and we're going to post it on our website on February 21st. I really want to emphasize that no decisions have been made, right? Department directors are not elected officials, but they are experts in their field. They have division directors and program managers who are bringing all that expertise to the table. And so they're kind of that first look at what fits into the budget based on the parameters that you've given us, and what things can we no longer afford to do based on those parameters. The chair takes all of that information, and then we're kind of in that next orange area there of 10 weeks. She's also having town hall meetings. She's meeting with community groups. She's meeting with other elected officials. We're spending a lot of time down in Salem because a lot of our budget comes from the state government. And she's going to have to take all that information and look across all the departments and prioritize the funding across all the departments. And then her budget will be released on April 24th. That will be kind of the first official decision-making on the actual budget and what's in and what's out. From there, we spend time in that kind of blue, that pink to blue area with the commissioners, with more public hearings, with our community budget advisory committees, getting feedback, input, surveys, and then the board is set to adopt, cross our fingers, on June 12th. So you can see that it feels like an expanded amount of time, but when you're trying to make decisions about a $4 billion budget and what's going to go into that and all the trade-offs that you have to do and how many people need to be engaged in this process, it starts to not feel like there's enough time in the budget process. If we can go to the next slide, please. So why does the budget have to be balanced? I like to just point this out, that we are not the federal government. We do not get to run a deficit. And so by Oregon law, the budget that the chair turns in, the expenditures have to be matched with resources. And we also need to identify everything that we think we're going to receive in resources. And we can't just put big pots of money aside that are unallocated. That's really important because as we're going through that public process, if you had big pots of money that were unallocated, the community wouldn't know what to respond to. They wouldn't know what's funded or not funded. And so we really want to make sure that that budget is presented in a way that the community can come and advocate for the programs that they think should be prioritized over other programs. If we can go to the next slide, please. And I think this presentation will be shared with y'all, so I'm not reading every word that's on the slide because I know you have a tight schedule today. It's delayed, I think.
Oh, sorry.
One more.
There we go.
So this is just the budget by the numbers. I always say in a budget presentation, you have to have numbers. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but you can see the magnitude of our budget. It's about $4 billion. It's about 6,000 FTE. And then we do a really good job at the county of funding all of our fiduciary kind of responsibilities, reserves, contingencies, those types of things, so that if there is a downturn, we're prepared. We also like to make sure that we get really high marks when bond rating agencies. So for the library bond that we just did a couple years ago, we kind of had the highest rating that an organization, and that saves us money in the long run because then they're charging us less in interest because we're not a risk in that situation. So if we can go to the next slide, please. oh no, this is the one, right? And then you're next. Yeah. So just a reminder, in that $4 billion budget, we also have 3 fairly significant voter initiatives that have come on in the last 5 years. So we have the Library Capital Bond Initiative, which hopefully y'all have been going out and seeing all the new libraries, and they're really exciting. The East County one is going to be really a really exciting opportunity. That number is going down over time. As we build buildings, we spend the money. The Supportive Housing Services Measure, which I'm sure you all have heard a lot about in the news, currently in the budget is about $304 million. That is a lot of carryover from the startup of the program. You're going to see going into next fiscal year, that number is going to be about $100 million lower. So that also is a ramp up, and then we're plateauing. But there's going to be not that kind of carryover of what we call beginning working capital available to fund those resources. And then finally, Preschool for All is about $572 million. That initiative was really designed over a 30-year period. So we collect money in the beginning, we design and we ramp up seats. And then what you see is then we start, as those numbers of seats are available for preschoolers, we're using that dedicated savings that we collected in the beginning of the tax to pay for the ongoing seats as we move forward. And I am now going to turn it over to our economist, and he's going to talk to you about, oh, sorry.
I think
Oh.
we did skip the bar graph one. I think did you want to go back into that one?
I think it's going to be okay. The next slide just tells you what you can find on our website. So if you're looking for information, we have Tableau dashboards, our forecast is there, we put videos on there, and it's all a public website. So everything that we do related to the budget process is in a public forum, and to make sure that people have information. So if you just really wanted to really get in deep, we have a Tableau dashboard for you, and we really encourage you to look at it and then maybe give us feedback and tell us what you think. Next slide, is it now? Oh, one other thing I wanted to highlight. The chair's guidance this year, as we were facing a $22 million deficit, sorry, I just stole your storyline, was that really she's asking departments not to submit a bunch of requests for new money. And that was really purposeful. She basically said to departments, if you're doing something that's so important, I need you to look within your base budget and fund that thing within your base budget. And then things that drop to the bottom of the list will be pushed out for cuts. Because you can imagine if departments are submitting these big reductions packages, and then also at the same time, a bunch of new requests for programs, having to prioritize those across 10 departments can be very, very difficult, and to figure out what the priorities are. So she's really asking the departments at the beginning of the process to really use their best thinking and bring their best thinking to this process. So we shouldn't be seeing a bunch of requests for new funding as we're going into the next fiscal year. Now, maybe? Yep.
Thank you, Christian. Next slide, please. So this will start with a question too. Why do we do a forecast? Why does the county employ an economist? It's the same answer as why do we budget at the start. It's required by law. So we have to publish a 5-year forecast so the community kind of knows what our assumptions are. But then deeper than that, we really try to use the forecast to provide the context for the decision making and to help the community understand the constraints on the decision making process. We're really trying to tell the story of what the county's doing. We get questions all the time that are basically, I have this great idea, why aren't you doing this? And oftentimes the answer is, yeah, that does sound like a pretty good idea, but here are the constraints that we're operating under and why we can't do that. So we want everyone to understand how it works. Next slide, please. Speaking of budgetary constraints, so we have some significant ones this year. On the revenue side, declining downtown property values are creating a really significant drag on revenue growth. It's the primary driver of our growing deficit, along with increases in personnel costs. We'll come back to that in a second. Labor costs on the expense side are the major driver of our expenditures. In some other presentations we do, we break down kind of what percent of our overall cost personnel is. It's about 2/3 of our general fund costs. But then when you look at contractual services, which is our second biggest expense source, about About half of contractual services is just passed through to community partners, where they're mostly paying people to do the work. And then even internal services, our IT and our facilities, a lot of that is paying facilities and IT professionals to do their work. So really changes in personnel costs are the driver of our increases in expenses. We also have fewer one-time only resources available this year than we've had the last several years. During the pandemic period, we had a higher level of underspending as some of our employees were pushed to American Rescue Plan funding. And then we also had the BIT, I'll just say it was extremely difficult to forecast during the early years of the pandemic, and we had some revenue that we hadn't anticipated. And then as everyone knows, I think there's no shortage of demand for county services. If we want to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Christian mentioned that in November we did a bigger forecast, so I'm going to go over the whole thing in 2 slides here. If you're curious about this, you can watch the hour-long presentation, which has a lot more slides. But for fiscal year 2026, I think the relevant number is that line in blue. So our starting point for the budget process this year is a $21.2 million deficit. So I think the easiest way to explain why we're in that position is if you listen to us talk about our forecast for over a long period of time, we talk about a structural deficit. And when we say structural deficit, what we mean is that there are limits on property tax growth in the Oregon Constitution that prevent our property taxes, which is our primary revenue source in the general fund, from growing as fast as our expenses do. So what we mean when we use that language is just over time, we expect our expenses to grow faster than our revenues. So increasing deficits is kind of our normal state of being. This year, it's particularly bad, and it's because of that slowdown in property tax growth. So in fiscal year 2026, just to continue to provide the current service level, which current service level just means all the stuff that we've done on an ongoing basis in the past, if we want to continue to provide that same level of programming in fiscal year 2026, we need about $30.4 million of new revenue. So we need our revenues to grow pretty significantly just to kind of stay flat. For fiscal year 2026, we expect to only get $8 million of new property tax revenue. So just fundamentally, the math doesn't work there. I'll come back to property tax in just a second. The deficit we expect to continue to grow mostly due to that structural deficit. In fiscal year 2028, there's a PERS issue that I kind of won't go into detail here that may or may not materialize, but we feel like we need to incorporate it into the forecast. And then when you get all the way out to 2030, we expect a $52.4 million deficit. That looks a little bit scarier than it actually is. So in that blue line, we're just assuming that we spend money at the same rate that we are now. So over time, our revenues and expenses would continue to diverge. As Christian said, we have to have a balanced budget in fiscal year 2026. So one way or another, we're going to get to balance. So that line on the bottom shows once we've balanced fiscal year 2026, that will take care of some of that ongoing deficit that we expect. So really 2026 is going to be our toughest year, or at least we anticipate it to be our toughest year. If we want to go to the next slide.
I was actually going to say we are a little over time. Do you mind if we go to questions? Is that okay?
Sure, no problem. Why don't you end on then, if you want to skip 2 and leave it on the resources. As Christian said, you can go to our website. Everything you need is there.
We have questions for our experts in the room.
I have questions related to the policies that we may be considering, but not necessarily related to the presentation they made.
Okay.
Is that okay? Or do we want to wait for a different time to engage in this?
Well, we'll be going into an in-depth discussion about like pricing out this program, if you will. So that might answer the questions you have if they're related to the policies. But if not, like feel free to ask now. We can always circle back.
Well, some of them are logistic. In terms of the pricing out, assuming that you would be helping us forecast over time, for example, if we were looking at a recommendation for a dedicated revenue source that involved, I don't know, something like Seattle, who's done a property tax, you would help us map out how much that could raise over time.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm usually involved in stuff like that, but I think it depends. Yeah.
And also its impact on compression, like all the different impacts of any policy decision that
Yeah,
we
I can,
would
I
make.
can
Okay,
do the
great.
compression stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, by all means.
Let's jump in. Hi, I'm Hayden Miller. I'm supporting Daniel in the COO's office on this project. I would just add as well, the program does have some budget for us to bring in external partners as well. So we do have resources to be able to go to like Eco Northwest or somebody like that, who we often use as a support resource. So just wanted to add that.
You mentioned that whenever you want, a department head wants a new program, the question is what, it's a higher priority than the old other stuff. What are you getting rid of? Which department, which program would a campaign finance program be in? Who are we telling they have to deprioritize something else?
That's a great question. So as of right now, this program lives in the Department of County Management, which is the department that is headed by our Chief Operating Officer and which really serves as the corporate backbone of the organization. In some ways, that was because the COO's office often serves as somewhat of an incubator for additional programs that may then go on to live somewhere else in the organization. The way that we've talked about this in the past around governance is, one, we're looking for a recommendation from the Implementation Advisory Committee on whether on what at a high level the governance structure should look like. So I know at the City of Portland, for example, they have the Independent Elections Commission that sits between their elected officials and the program itself. Often, and Christian and Jeff could talk about this, there'll be non-departmental offices, which we have a lot of those. That's what our local Public Safety Coordinating Council, that's what our Office of Diversity and Equity, they all fall into that. So there's a range of ways. But for the moment, this program lives in the Department of County Management. And so in terms of the fiscal year 26 submissions, it will live there in the departmental submitted budget.
I hate to be that kind of facilitator, but we do need to wrap up to move on for something else. So if you have any questions for these folks, you could definitely email them to me and I can circle back with answers too. And we'll certainly be talking about budget throughout this entire process as well. Thank you all so much for coming
Thank
and
you.
joining us
Thanks for
today.
inviting us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Let us know what you think of those dashboards.
Yes, they're cool.
Okay.
Pool and budget go together.
Well,
but
you know,
those are interesting.
Okay. So why don't we jump into the funding analysis, which is, this is the question of how much is a program like this going to cost, is the core of what we're looking into. And so just to give you a scope, we're just talking about the matching funds we provide. We're not talking about, administrative costs or staffing costs or setting up a website. Those are things that we can price out for you all later and circle back on. This is just the matching funds that we're looking for. And I'm going to go through this, but I want to show it to you also to get your expert opinions on it. So like, if you see something that you think is a little off, I'm mostly using historical analysis and the experience with the Portland Elections Commission to build this, but you all are experts. And so if you feel like there's a number here that needs to be adjusted, please let me know. So looking at this, to build a recommendation for how much the program is going to cost and estimate, we had to look at a large number of factors. And so let's see if I can just like expand this window a little bit more for you all. So the first thing we had to look at was how many candidates typically run for these county races. And so we have this number here. I looked at all the races, from between now and 2016. And then, we mapped them all out. These are inclusive of candidates who were in the primary and maybe dropped out, or were in the primary and, may have not gotten that many votes. But it does represent the universe we're working in terms of what to expect for people who are going to be running for office. One key takeaway from this is a significantly fewer number of people run for county historically than for city offices. And there's a wide number of factors for that. But, in the last city council race, we had 120 some candidates running. I don't think that's going to happen in the county anytime soon. So I think that's an important key thing to bring out here. For the chair's race, in the last few years, the average candidates were 6. We had 6 in the chair's race, 15 running for the commissioner races combined. The auditor, we of course have an elected auditor here. We don't, in a previous race, we had 2 candidates running in 2018, and then it was unopposed in 2022. And then same with the sheriff, but kind of in reverse, like they had a competitive race in 2022, but there was no, it was unopposed in 2018. I still put that at 2, even though like it actually averages out a little less than that, just because I think we should always have the expectation that these races will be competitive on some level. So that's how many candidates we typically have running for these races. And the question though is anticipated candidates, because we have to know not only how many candidates are going to run, but we are talking about 2 potential reforms that increase Democratic engagement. Number 1 is we might have a public matching program. And number 2 is we have ranked choice voting next year. And both of those are proven to encourage more candidates to run for office. So what we did here is we actually looked down into other municipalities that have both public matching and ranked choice voting to kind of glean some historical data from this. So we'll start with Portland, which has both, but you see these skyrocketing numbers, 520% plus increase in the number of candidates running for some of these seats. Again, I don't think we're going to have anything more close to that, because not only do they have all those reforms in place, but also they had top 3 winning. So instead of just one winner, they have 3, and that encourages more candidates to run. And then all of them were technically open seats. We had like 1 incumbent running for re-election, and outside the mayoral race, and but otherwise they're all open seats. So a lot more people are going to run for those. But we're not, setting up a similar system at the county, and so I don't think Portland is a totally even match. The one thing I will point to is the mayoral race. We see that actually there's not a huge percentage difference in the people who run for mayor for Portland. And that does help us understand it more, because that is ranked choice voting, and it is one vote, one candidate wins. And that will be similar to the system we have. So the mayoral race kind of gives us a little bit more clarity than the city council does for Portland.
Can I ask a question? Do you have data for what the increase was when the city enacted their matching program? And if there was a significant, I know it was without RCV, but if there was a significant increase in the number of filed candidates?
Yeah, we actually do. And so you can actually see that here. This is the acronyms I'm using is no public campaign financing. And I'm sorry, it's supposed to be no RCV average. So this is, you can see for council seats, these used to be citywide. And again, there was no public campaign financing, there was no ranked choice voting. So we had a smaller number of people running. Then when the city moved to, it had public campaign financing, but did not have ranked choice voting. So we're talking about 2020 and 2022.
Mm-hmm.
That's the increase we have there. And then when we move over to this last year, when we had both those reforms operating at the same time, that's when it really shot up in terms of the number of candidates running. Looking at Seattle, though, might be a better option, because Seattle it doesn't have ranked choice voting yet. It will adopt that in this next coming cycle. But it did have several cycles where it had public matching. And it had a version called vouchers, which we'll talk about later. But they did have it, and you can see here, generally, the mayoral race saw a 66% increase in the number of candidates running for office. Most of these other races had around an average, I think, of 58% increase in people running for office. Now, none of these other municipalities map on perfectly, because there's a wide number of factors here: popularity of incumbents, what are the issues on the ballot at the time, and certainly like unique cultural dynamics to each municipality. So we're just trying to glean broad data here. But we can see an average of 58% increase for city council races, candidates in Seattle. New York is an interesting thing to compare it to, because they've had public financing for 30 years, but they adopt ranked choice voting very recently. And they also have district races like we do, which of course, so does Seattle. So you can see here, with New York, we went from 252 candidates to 582 candidates. I don't think we're going to be doing anything close like that at the county. But it does. I think the thing to know is that New York has 51 members in their city council. That's why the number's so high. And mayor went from 37 to 74%. In 2023, because New York has its elections odd years, no one ran for mayor, but they had a drop in the people who are running for city council because there were not as many open seats. A lot of incumbents sought re-election. And that's probably the biggest individual factor to the number of candidates we have is are the incumbents running for re-election or not. So this is yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This is super helpful and really thorough. In addition to tracking how many candidates there were, could we add a data point about how many of them qualified for the matching program?
I have that in the next slide, next tab.
Okay.
And I'm just reviewing my methodology for you all to see how we got to these numbers, and also to give you a chance to ask me to tweak numbers if you might know something that I don't. And so in general, we assume we're going to go with a 58% increase for Seattle, 49% increase for city council races in New York, 67% for the mayor, and New York NYC is 100% increase. I'm talking about mayor just because we also have an executive who runs countywide, the county chair here. So it's kind of analogous to the mayor that they have for this purposes.
Although that New York City mayor's race, was that the first post-Bloomberg race?
I believe it was the first post. Oh, no, actually, no. It was the first post de Blasio race.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good question.
And the first Trump race, to me, that one election is a very different election.
Yes. Yeah, good point. So what I do is I took these percentages here and I applied them to the number of candidates who have typically run for office in the county races. So for instance, if we do an 84% increase for candidates who run for chair, which is 67% plus 100%, the average of the two. So when you have that, you have 84% increase likely for people who are running for chair with a public financing system and a ranked choice voting system.
It does not include Portland mayor. That's just New York and Seattle.
Yes. And then actually, if you give me 1 second, Felisa Hagens asked for requested access. And I want to make sure that she can follow along. So
Sorry, I can't flip the slides and the camera keeps going to a blank chair. So it's kind of a weird situation.
No worries. I just shared it with you, Felisa. Okay. Why is it not sending?
Should this be shared in the WebEx?
It does. Actually, I think, Felisa, the issue is that there's a little bit of an issue here with, can I let you in this document or not? Because it's in a file that's restricted.
It's fine. You can just share it with me later. I'll just try to follow along.
Okay, apologies for that. So it is your honor. Thank you, Hayden. So we applied these same percentage increases to people who ran for county office, and that's how we got to a higher average. This is what we expect for people running for office in the next series of election cycles. Again, this is an estimate based on historical data. It may be off from what we really see based on unique factors the next few election cycles. So that would be a grain of salt to add. This gives us more of a broad picture than it does, to be taken literally. And then of course, not all of the candidates run in the same year. We have alternating elections here in the county. So, in 2026, we're going to see the 11 candidates who run for chair will be up, and the 8 candidates who run for District 2, and the 2 who run for auditor, and the 2 who run for sheriff. 2026, we'll see the other seats up, and then it repeats 2030, 2032.
Why do you assume no growth in candidates for auditor and sheriff?
I assume no growth for candidates for those two because when the city of Portland adopted those reforms, we actually didn't even have a competitive auditor's race last year. And auditor is a little bit of a trickier one. have a lot more restrictions on who can run. You generally have to be a licensed CPA in order to run for auditor. So the universe is not that large. Again, might be a surprise, you might see 4 candidates run. And same with sheriff too. Portland, we didn't see that increase bear out, but again, we have unique factors here in the county. I think the point is like, we might see 2 to 3 to 4 candidates running, but I don't think we're going to see 10 candidates running for auditor anytime soon. So that's how yeah.
Lisa, I just sent you a copy of the slideshow, so you should have it now.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thanks, Hayden. So that's how I get the anticipated number of candidates. And then the next question is how many are going to sign up for this program? Because these programs are optional. So this is getting your question, Becca. What we did is we looked at Portland races. And when the program was it passed in 2016, but it was first launched in 2020. And so we saw there were 21 candidates who ran for mayor in that year. And they include write-in candidates too. Anyone who basically just got on the ballot, but only 1 actually ended up participating in the program. And I think partially because it was the first year and there was an incumbent on the ballot. So I'm kind of taking out with a little bit of an asterisk, but we had 1, and that was a 5% qualification rate. For 2024 mayor, had an open race. And again, we had that unique factor of like suddenly we had ranked choice voting. And so we had 21 candidates running, 8 participating in the program, 5 qualified. Because the qualification metrics are generally high enough in these programs that not everyone's going to get in. So we had a 24% qualification rate for the mayoral race. In the last city council races, we saw 39 candidates because it was a special race that year. We actually had 3 of the 4 council districts on at the same time. 2022, we had fewer candidates running. 2024, of course, we had a wide number of candidates running. And you can see the participating number and the qualifying number, we have kind of a little bit of variation. So that's why we average them. So at the end of the day, the long story short is we expect, based on the averages, around 39% of people who run for city council got qualified. And technically 14% of people who ran for mayor got qualified. But I think I'm going to kind of remove that the first year just because I think it was an anomaly. Like there's no way only 1 person is going to get qualified for like future mayoral races. Yeah.
I should know this, but did anything change in terms of the qualification requirements between 2022 and 2024 city council?
Good question. I don't think they did. I think the matching amounts did, but I think the qualification have remained.
Matching amount came down.
Yes, yeah, they've changed, but I think, and also the match rate has changed in that time period. But it was always, I think, 750 donors to qualify for mayor if you're running for a city, for the city program.
So what do you attribute the increase in the percentage of people who qualified on the city council races in 2024?
Well, city council only has 250 donors to qualify. Yeah. It's a much lower threshold.
But that was the same before, though.
Oh no, that was always 250.
Right. So it didn't change. So why did the qualifying percentage go up from 23 to 42?
Oh, I see. I think there's just greater awareness of the program, and like more organizations, maybe direct candidates to participate in the program. People read things in the news too, and that impacts what they do. And of course, the incumbency rate impacts like what quality of candidates are running, and then who can raise a high amount of money.
Incumbency, right?
So kind of a number of factors here. That's why we pull up an average. And so then I took the anticipated number of candidates who ran for county office, and then applied those same qualification metrics. And so this is how many we expect to qualify for at least the next cycle, or like the next 2 election cycles, because that involves all the races up.
Well, and this is under a matching program. I know that that both vouchers and grants have some type of qualification, but I can't remember what the qualification was for the democracy dollars, the voucher program. It's like a number of small donors. Was it the same? Was it a threshold or signatures? I can't remember.
I don't have that number available, but every program always has a qualification metric.
Yeah.
All of them have to prove some level of popular support to get into the program. And then we're going to look at fundraising. So I took all these numbers here. And then the other question is, how much do candidates typically raise? So I looked at all the 24 races that happened between 2014 and 2024. And then these are the candidates who ran, who, you know, generally like performed pretty well at the ballot and raised at least like a somewhat significant amount of money. And you can see here, I anonymize their names just because like it's public information you can find on Orstar, but I want the focus to be on the numbers here. So you can see like candidates raised in 2014, one candidate raised $465,000. But then when you look at 2022, the candidates raised $179,000 and $236,000 respectively. And then we look at every single district. So we also have, based on historical information, this is how much candidates were raising. And same with District 2, we always have a big field in District 2, District 3, District 4. Auditor, we had a competitive auditor race in 2018, but it didn't raise a lot of money. 25,000 is relatively small compared to what other candidates were raising.
When did the campaign finance limits come in?
2020.
20.
So these were before the limits. And then the sheriff's race too, we actually had an unusually expensive sheriff's race. So then what we did was we averaged the election years. So like 2014, these two numbers together averaged at 397,000. And then we averaged these numbers together per year. And then we look at pre and post limits. So for instance, before the limits were in place, the average amount candidates raised when they ran for chair was close to 400,000. After limits, that number dropped to 200,000. So I think that speaks to the impact that limits had. And you kind of, sometimes you do see a dramatic fall, sometimes you don't at all. Then we took these numbers and put them next to each other. And I actually didn't want to do averages just because I didn't want to base these numbers based on averages just because I think one candidate raised $17,000, and that's generally not what candidates are going to raise when they run for office. So I was wary of that influencing the data too much. So what I actually did was drew it based on the top fundraisers. These are people who generally raise over $100,000. We had one person raise a little less than that, but generally they raise over $100,000. And then, so I think we see a pretty drastic difference as a result of the limits. If you move over here, you see the difference. So in the chair's race, you see a $189,000 difference because of limits. The commissioner race, we saw a $46,000 difference. And we didn't really see one in auditor and sheriff because they don't have many competitive races. There's not a lot of data to work with. The reason I'm bringing this all up is because one of the core questions that you all grapple with is, do you want to give the candidates enough in matching funds that they could run a competitive race like they could before the limits? I think one of the complaints about the contribution limits is that or I should say one of the concerns about it, is that it restricted candidates so much that they really couldn't get their message out. And they couldn't really engage with voters as much. And so if we provide matching funds to candidates that take some kind of larger than what they could raise under the limits, that would give them more resources to engage with voters. Yeah.
So there's a couple things that aren't really reflected in these numbers. And one is really the adjustment for inflation when you're looking at a 2014 candidate versus a 22 candidate. And I also don't see anything that reflects what's going on holistically, like on a global political Oregon snapshot. So in 22, we had the governor's race, the labor commissioner's race. We had some high ticket, high dollar races, and we had an independent candidate running for governor, which drove all the media dollars became really, really expensive. So even took them beyond normal limits of inflation, what you would normally expect in that particular, trying to get your message out. So you can see the discrepancy in when we had pre-limit versus, today's, but I don't think those numbers necessarily reflect the actual impact to candidates.
It's worse than it looks.
I think it's way worse than it looks, to be real honest with you, because I don't think at $200,000, if you're in a year where you're running for chair at $200,000, then you have the governor and all these other races going on. And the opposite side of that could be true as well, where you could have, Tina could run unopposed And then there is no money. I mean, it's not going to happen, but in theory, right? And so that totally changes the dynamics of what's happening in that particular election year. So that becomes just something to consider when we're looking at those numbers, because I'll tell you, $200,000 in today's dollars doesn't get you very far.
Yeah.
$200,000 isn't even in those days, dollars would even allow you to mail countywide one flight.
I appreciate that insight. Yeah, I think, it's very difficult to quantify all of the different metrics out there and the factors that influence races too. We have historical data, and of course we have your expertise here. And so that's why I'm really glad to hear that, that insight.
By the way, are these November numbers, May numbers combined?
Oh, good question. So I tried to go with November numbers in general, just because now we're not going to have a primary going forward. We're just going to have one election in November. So I tried to find other races that match that. It's a little bit of a hiccup because when we had the previous system, candidates would raise a lot of money for the primary, spend it all then, and then raise a lot for the general and spend it all then. So their spending patterns aren't going to look the same, and their fundraising is going to look different if you only have one race, or sorry, one election. But I think that would be in terms of the amount of time they were fundraising, the November ones do provide a better map than what someone running from October to May would provide.
But when you say the average was 208 for chair, that's the November election, not the combined May, November.
Yeah, generally I isolated this for November candidates. There are a couple that were just primary candidates, particularly the sheriff and auditor races. Actually, no, I think the sheriff's race did go to the runoff, if I remember right.
I guess my point is that there's going to be expenses that you undertake in the primary. You're spending out of primary dollars that you don't then renew that expense in the general. You build a website, you do a poll, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think so for instance, there's a special race in 2023, special election for District 3. That one ended in May. I still included it though, because actually there's not that many competitive races in District 3 to draw on. So I still wanted to bring that information in for you all. But you're right, that does impact the information we're seeing too.
I think Felisa was trying to say something.
Oh, yeah,
I feel
Felisa,
like
go
one of
ahead.
the questions I had, I feel like this information is helpful. I think that the cost per voter actually I feel like is a more would be a more helpful, accurate sort of measurement than the overall cost, because I think that gets to Marshall's point about when you have more engaged elections, you have higher election turnout, right? And it drives the cost per voter up in any of those races, like TV gets more expensive, et cetera. And it also addresses Becca's point. What is the actual cost per voter to communicate to voters? If you sort of broke it down, that can range anywhere from, $15 per voter to $25 per voter if you're sort of on TV and doing a bunch of that stuff. But I feel like that helps sort of suss out where an election was at in a snapshot in time. And then I think as we're talking about the methodology moving forward, I think we can go through all of this historical data and we all sort of have our own takes on it. But I feel like for me, if I think about a program that really funds communication is based on a cost per voter. So and is tied to inflation, similar to what Marshall is outlining.
Felisa, are you talking about cost per registered voter or cost per voter that turned out in that election or cost per voter that voted for that candidate?
Cost per voter that turned out in that election.
How do you adjust that for an auditor's race? There's not as much communication from candidates, but they still have the same universe as someone running for chair. How do you
Just do the math.
You did
An
that.
auditor's race is $4.80 a voter, and a chair's race is $15 a voter.
Oh, I see. Just number
And
of
the
people
county
that actually spend
commission's
out the vote.
races, and the county commission race is $12 a voter.
Okay. I'd love to engage with. I think I'm gonna ask that we engage on that on a side conversation because it's valuable. I just would love to learn more about how to price that out and bring that analysis to you. But I do appreciate that point too.
I love the historical data. This is super interesting and helpful. It would also be really interesting to see how much was spent on the independent expenditure side post limits. If you could add that in, which is a little harder to quantify, but in theory, everyone is reporting how much they spent to help get someone elected.
They're telling the truth. It's not that hard.
Yeah, you're right. It's a little challenging because Orstar has limitations and
Yeah.
what data we can pull from that.
I don't, on the
yeah.
independent expenditure side, Becca, I actually don't think I don't think necessarily everybody is reporting what they spent because there isn't a requirement there wasn't a requirement on the independent expenditure side pre-limits that you actually report
Yeah,
it.
it's true.
So you could just
Yeah.
send out mail without coordinating with a candidate and never report it. And especially if you paid for it, not out of a pack.
Yeah, just post limits, I think.
Yeah.
Again, if
That's
part of
right.
our goal here.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
If our goal here is to generate a system that generates enough money for the candidates that we largely discourage independent expenditures, we want to add that to the mix here too.
Yeah, well, and so that's why I wanted to present a range of options for you all when it came to this question. So just like turning your attention back here, if we did a minimum, a medium, and a robust program funding, this is what it would look like. So I drafted these numbers, but again, if you all feel it could be a different range of options, please let me know. So if we, just to keep it even and understandable for everyone, and for the purpose of this conversation, if we added $100,000 in matching funds, where would that take the candidates historically? And like, if we added $250,000 in matching funds, how would that take a chair's race historically? And then same with $350,000 in matching funds. I think the robust option, I did want to add in a little bit more just to make sure there was some response to independent expenditures. But yeah, I mean, like, you know, it's challenging just because like there's no limits on independent expenditures versus it's United. And I will be giving a presentation on like the legal landscape we're dealing with too. That will cover that.
When you describe these three Goldilocks scenarios, are you thinking them as a potential maximum that we would have for the highest qualifying candidate? Or are you thinking of these as the sort of three tiers that people would climb their way through if they got more and more qualified?
Yeah, great question. So I was thinking about this as like for the funding purposes only. How much, if we funded them at a minimum amount, then that would provide them, you know, for instance, for a chair, $100,000. For a commissioner candidate, it would provide them $50,000 total. Sheriff, $50,000 total. Auditor, $25,000 total. Again, that's the minimum. So the medium amount would be like $250,000 for chair, $100,000 for commissioner, sheriff 75, auditor $50K, and then higher for robust. And then I added that against how much candidates historically raised to see what it compared to for the time before limits. So if you looked at the historical data and added that minimum, medium, robust calculations in, a candidate running for chair would be able to raise around $300,000 with a minimum $450,000 for a medium amount of funding and $558,000 for a robust amount of funding. So that gives us a sense of if we applied those numbers to historical data, where would that get the candidates now? The final thing I want to show you is where does that leave us? So combining all this information together, we have the total anticipated number of candidates, the percent who are going to qualify, likely, the total number of them who are qualifying are rounded up, generally, the minimum match, the median match, and the robust match. And then here's how much that would cost in terms of the matching funds we provide. So for instance, if we provide the minimum amount to the candidates running for chair in 2026, it'll likely mean giving up, the county would spend $300,000 in matching funds. And then same with the medium total. If we gave the chair candidates a medium amount, that would result in the county spending $750,000. So
I'm not seeing where you're getting that number because I see a minimum match of 100,000. How do you go from 100,000 to 300,000? Where's that?
that is the number of candidates we expect to qualify
Ah,
three
okay.
times the
Thank you.
median match.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Total
And-
budget.
I know it's a dizzying amount of
Mhm.
numbers to throw at you, so please feel free to ask clarifying questions.
Well, and this is assuming a matching program. So these numbers would not work with a voucher program.
Well, almost all programs, regardless of type, do have a matching ceiling.
Yes, but I mean, how would you anticipate splitting up $750,000 for chair candidates among 576,000 registered voters in Multnomah County with democracy dollars? Like, how would you do it in a voucher
What,
system? is
what the
I'm-
Seattle voucher does is it just redeems the voucher for the candidate until the candidate hits the cap. And then it stops redeeming it for those candidates. So if a candidate collects like 300,000 in vouchers, and that's the cap is 300,000, they're allowed to raise in matching funds. That's how much they have. And that they get vouchers after, I don't think those vouchers count. And that is a problem with the system that we'll be talking about in our next presentation.
They take money
But
from
yeah,
the candidate.
the answer to your question is almost every program does have a matching cap.
Well,
Right.
and with Seattle's experience, we would learn what percentage of voters would actually redeem them.
Yeah.
5% or 8% or 10%. And then you can say, well, if our number is $750,000, only 10% of the vouchers get redeemed. You can put the equivalent of $7.5 million worth of vouchers out into the universe, as long as you got them
Knowing
capped.
that you would just get that percentage back.
And
Yeah.
you
I think it was like 3%. Yeah.
And generally programs have a match cap because the government can't give out unlimited funds. Like it does have to protect its general budget.
Democracy is priceless.
I believe it too. And so what we did was then we mapped it on to how many are going to run in, how many candidates are running per year, because it's not always going to be the same number of candidates. And now we have a sense of how much we'll be spending each year if we did a minimum, a medium, and a robust level of funding. So if we did the robust level of funding, we would be spending, or minimum amount of funding, we'd be sending $600,000 between all the candidates on the minimum amount of funding. And in 28 it would be 450,000 because we don't have a chairs race then. Media, if we did the median, we would spend 1.3 million on all the candidates running for office, or 900,000 in a non-chair election year. And then if we did the robust, we'd be spending $2 million, for candidates running, and 1.8 million in a non-chair year. So I think, and then if you calculate it out based on like all these years together, for all the years that we just have 2026 to 2032, it'd be 2.1 million at a minimum. For the medium amount, it'd be 4.4 million. And for the robust amount, it'd be 7.6 million. So I just want to run through my methodology with you all. Again, I note our thoughts about like unique factors involved in this, and then of course the methodology for how we distribute the funds, and then of course also like the price per voter. So that's something I can take back with me. But we just ran through a lightning quick amount of data. So I would love to hear like what your thoughts are on these kind of numbers too. Do they sound like somewhat realistic to people running for office? Yeah, Marshall.
I just have a couple thoughts on all that. One, I do agree we have to have some sort of baseline budget of what we're spending. What do we do when we have 5 candidates for chair? So that's something that has to be considered, because those numbers to me look too low. Like just based on my experience in Oregon politics, those numbers look too low. And that was one of the biggest failings of the city of Portland's, is they just didn't anticipate the numbers and they ran out of money, right? So it really gets terrible when you run out of money in this type of a system. Secondly, what I would want to know is, okay, so if we establish a match of $100,000 cap per candidate, what is the requirement for them to fundraise to get to that $100,000? Because that gives me a picture of what they actually have to spend in their race versus the city spending $100,000, because they have to raise $100,000 to get $100,000. They actually have a $200,000 budget, totally different than $100,000. So those are the two things that I see right now. Like those numbers to me feel really too small. And what happens if they're wrong, right, high or low, and then what's the projected actual budgets of each candidate at each level. Those would be things.
And that's where the match program matters, right? If we're saying you got to raise $200,000 to get $100,000,
Mhm.
$300,000 to get $100,000, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, if you also say, oh, you only have to raise $20,000 to get $100,000, we got a whole lot of people to qualify.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. So this is where this all.
But
Well, and
which
even
also
thinking in
is like
terms of,
more
like-
the like philosophical value of a public financing system is removing barriers for
Mhm.
participation.
If I can speak to those 2 points, you're absolutely right on, you know, the issue that happened with the city of Portland, just to catch everyone up, is in the previous election cycle, the city council did not give enough funding to the program. And the program didn't want to like give out a lot of funding to the candidates who were first in and then not have any left for anyone after. So what they did was they lowered the total amount of matching funds they could give out to candidates. And they lowered them pretty significantly just because the fund, like it was such inadequate funding from the city council. And that really hurt candidates. Candidates very much struggle with that. And they often anticipated being able to hire like these many staff members or have these many commercials, you know, as an example, but they couldn't because the program had to lower the match rate. So the last thing we want to do is not have enough money. And that's why I would really strongly advocate for these are the numbers that we're thinking about, but add in some contingency funds too. Because you're right, we could have a year where 5 people run for chair. And we want to make sure we're prepared for those situations. If we don't use the surplus, we roll it over to the next cycle, and then we don't have to ask as much for the county, which is great. So
Is that true? The money would roll over?
it could totally roll over, absolutely. And then that's what happened in the
But
city
the
of
county
Portland.
could also sweep the money, right?
Yeah, especially in
Like, I think you're saying under an ideal scenario that it would roll over, but the reality is when you're in a budget deficit, you have a program with extra money at the end of the year.
yeah.
Whatever
Yeah.
government sweeps the money and funds whatever program is in the deficit.
Yeah,
That-
and
that's
it
totally
does a rebalance. One of the questions I was going to ask Christian is elections are calendar year, budgets are fiscal year. And so when they pass, when the chair is putting together her budget, she's doing it in April so I'm just trying to anticipate, like if and when this goes into effect, say 2026, and the chair is building a budget for the 25-26 year, there'll be some amount of budget, but then it goes away July 1, right? So there's like, and then the next, the budget cycle, folks sitting up here regularly will have to approve. So there's like lack of consistency, so whatever oversight body might have the same experience that the city of Portland did, which is uncertainty around budget. The program could be defunded for the second half of the campaign
Yes.
calendar year.
Yeah, you know, so the county does things a little bit differently than the city. The city funds biennial budgets. The county does 1 year at a time.
Yeah.
So it does change the calculation. I do have a little bit of a sheet I gave out to you about like different funding options to how to make sure there's more reliability in that. But yeah, I think, you know, what it did was the city would just evenly or try to evenly fund every single year, knowing that most of the money is spent in like a quarter of that 2-year cycle too. The answer to your other question, Marshall, is to speak to it. I just want to clarify here 2 things. Number one, this all depends on the contribution limits that you all set. So if you all set lower contribution limits, that means candidates would have to raise more money in order to get, you know, in order to meet the matching thresholds they need. And then, so I base this on the county's limit, which is $603. So this, if you all didn't change the contribution limits at all and kept the charter limits in, this is like that. This is where these numbers are coming from. But if you did want to like institute a $350 limit, like what the city of Portland does, then we would have to like rethink what the calculations look like. The other thing is that I just want to clarify too, under these programs, generally under these programs, the candidates raise the money they have from private individuals and organizations, and then the matching funds come in on top of that. So if you see, you know, $100,000 for a sheriff's race, that's not their total budget. That's just the amount the program gives them. That would be on top of the additional money that they would raise in our own fundraising process.
And do you, maybe you know this off the top of your head, but what is the administrative cost? What's the cost of administrating the city of Portland's small donor program?
Depends on how complicated the program is to administer. I think the city, I don't want to give you a wrong number here. I would argue that the city didn't have enough staff members in the previous election cycle. And so you definitely want to make sure you have
I mean,
enough.
there's only 118 candidates.
So definitely recommend like having capacity, or maybe working out a situation where we share it with the Department of Elections, who does like some level of auditing too. That could be an option as well. What other I can try to come back to you all with a cost per voter analysis, if that is helpful. I do think that there is a desire to get a budget recommendation from you all early, just because the process is so accelerated, as we saw in the presentation. So is that how you would like me to proceed? You all want me to circle back with that?
So in order to give a budget idea to them, we would need to decide on if we're doing match back, if we're doing vouchers. Like, I don't see how we could give a proposed budget without having that match back piece.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a decision that you all can make on the earlier end too. And that's why it's actually next on our agenda, or it's on the agenda, it's not next. But you are allowed to certainly set like the contribution or the match cap for any kind of program. Some programs don't do well with a low match cap. I think vouchers would struggle with that. But you are allowed to set a match cap for any kind of way that we distribute the funds.
Yeah.
And then we can work from there too.
Yeah. I just, in my own brain, I was trying to think through like time-wise, what would be helpful for us to have in order to give that proposal.
Yeah.
I mean, the chair is building her budget right now, right? And so do you see, could we give a recommendation to the chair that had an amount while we were still trying to figure out the actual policy? I mean, regardless of whether or not it were grants or vouchers or.
You could totally do that. And, my office has been in contact with the chair's office about these, and like they're aware that we're kind of like on this timeline that we have here. So I think we do have a little bit more flexibility than like what was expressed in the budget presentation earlier too.
I would think we would want to be aggressive then in that way and say, oh, it turns out, hey, later, 6 weeks later, 2 months later, actually it's a little less. But then we want to go, it needs to be a little higher than we initially asked for, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fair question and all of that, because if we were going into this knowing, okay, we can spend no more than $10 million, period, that's a different program than, okay, we can spend $50 million or we can spend $25 million. Those are all totally different parameters to work under.
Yeah.
If we're working at, what did we end up at, like 8 million roughly kind of on your setup there. I mean, that if we doubled that, again, that's totally different. And I think to your point, then that gives us the framework of what we actually could build at that point.
Yeah.
I think there would be some value in having even just a ballpark, this is what we're penciling out for that particular program, because I think that's going to affect the matching funds and all the other thing. Doesn't do us any good to come up with a budget of, $10 million if we're only going to get $2.5 million for the program.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That's because that at $2.5 million, our recommendation might be scrap the whole damn thing and go to state limits, right? And let people contribute so candidates can get their measures. I mean, that, you know what I'm saying? So there's so many unknowns in this, and it's really complicated in general. Without having some basic framework in which to work from, I think it's really difficult to come up with the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely think that, we're trying to do all these conversations simultaneously in a way. But I do think like having that budget recommendation or having a number at least lets us start the conversation.
Agreed.
With, the folks who make the decisions on this. So that's why I brought this to you early. I can certainly circle back with, in our next meeting, we can talk about the, what's the word I'm looking for? The price by voter.
Mhm.
I could try to figure something out around that. Yeah.
What's the, like, do we have a deadline from the chair's office?
The deadline is going to be later March.
Okay.
Is going to be the deadline, but they also want us to provide a report with the recommendations by that time too.
So they're not looking for us for a number like 3 weeks from now. It's,
I think the one early, I think we do have some flexibility on it though. And we can fudge the dates a little bit, but I do think they want it early. And I think at the very least, if we have like a preliminary number to bring to them, like a range, so we don't show up and be like $50 million. If we have like a kind of a little bit more of a ballpark figure, as we were talking about before, I think that would at least help the conversation get started, and we could figure out the parameters a little bit more based on that.
Do you know, or does anybody know what, I know it'll be different numbers for us, but what Portland's budget was for Matchback program?
Yeah, so usually they would try to provide $1.3 million per year.
Mhm.
And I actually think they did almost every single year, including 2024. It's just 2024, there was more candidates than that. But yeah, it's generally 1.3 million, and it was capped. It was, I think, capped at like 0.2% of the general fund budget overall.
Okay, cool. That's helpful.
so 2.6 million election cycle.
For an election, yeah, for an election cycle, yeah, that's right.
The other thing, I know this is, we're trying to do everything all at once, but the other thing I'd be super interested in is getting some information about what a dedicated source of revenue could raise, whether it's like what Seattle is, the property tax of $8 or whatever per thousand. And
is really
I
killing
was
this
looking at one of the documents you provided, realizing that some of the public financing programs use like 5 different revenue sources,
Right.
including like fines and,
Mhm.
so I'm super curious on getting a little bit more information around the feasibility and stability of all of those different funding mechanisms other than the general fund.
Yeah, boy, the way you set me up for these transitions is incredible.
Nice.
So I think
Bring her.
let's talk about some funding options. This is a broad conversation. We're just sketching out the ideas, the mechanisms that the county has. I think we have to, like, of course, look into the feasibility of each of these. But what I'm hoping for is guidance about like what is on the table and what's like off the table for you all at first blush. So a lot of localities do a general fund allocation, and that every year in their budget process, they just set aside whatever amount of money it is. And that's what the city does. I would say that that's the most common and easiest way to go about it, but it comes with some really significant downsides. And if there's a budget crunch, or if the just certain members of the council just didn't like the program, or felt there were like competing interests out there, we never really knew how much we were going to get until it was like later on in the budget season. And kind of like living and dying by each budget cycle is very challenging for the program and for the candidates, because we can't really forecast the amount they're going to get. So just, I
Can
don't
I
want
ask a question about that?
Yeah, go ahead, Felisa.
I think one of my questions, and you might have to ask the city attorney's office, is there any, so some governments have dedicated funds that are spent on a different cycle than the budget cycle, that where money is allocated to that dedicated fund in advance. And so is that a recommendation that we could make under the county, like, rules or budget rules, is that you set up a dedicated fund where you actually fund the program a year in advance of the election with money that is then transferred into that dedicated fund. So candidates know, like, this is the amount of money that the county has set aside for the program, period. And then you do it, basically it's off budget cycle, if that makes sense. So if I were just to sort of say, so they would do it in 2025 for the 2026 election. They would do it in 2027 for the 2028 election. So you're not doing it the year of the election.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing idea. I don't know the answer for the city or whether the county has that ability. That's something I would have to like look into, but I do hear the suggestion. So funding by a board is, not trying to disrespect anyone who serves in elected office, but you are kind of at the whims of like elected officials all the time. And like that is a very stressful place to be for a program. It's not the best funding option. One other idea is funding, like the county board, who are elected officials and do answer to the public. So you do want some of that oversight on your funding. But if the county board can fund the program, but they have like some parameters. So maybe they have like a funding formula in place. Maybe like cost per voter, for instance. Or they might have to like kind of hew to the oversight committee's recommendation. At the city, the oversight committee has a charter protected right to make a recommendation. The city council can ignore it or doesn't have to like follow through with it, but at least that conversation is had in public. And there may be other parameters that come in mind too, but you can recommend that the board still have the power to fund the program, but they have to do it within like certain restrictions to protect the program's financial health. You can certainly do, some programs are funded by taxes and fees. And I think, Seattle's funded by a property tax. And the county board, could establish, I think, taxes, or they could refer to voters. I would, I think that you have to be a little bit careful just because the governor has, put out an advisory asking localities not to raise taxes for the next few years. And I do think you really have to take the temperature of the voters before sending out a ballot measure like that. But new taxes and fees are certainly an option.
Can I add another thing to put on the list
Yeah.
to ask the county attorneys? I think we'll talk about this, but there are other potential issues for consideration that we could send to voters. Will you ask the county attorneys if we send substantive policy issues related to a public matching program or changing parts of the charter related to campaign finance, coupled with a revenue mechanism, if they believe that it doesn't violate single subject, if it goes together, if you could do both in one? Will
I
you
see what
ask
you're
them?
saying. Yeah, we definitely have, we do have a agenda item on the charter, whether or not like a charter recommendation would be necessary. And so like single subject has been like on my mind for sure.
Rules changes plus funding source is that one subject.
Yeah, because it's all under campaign finance. I mean, I'm assuming it is because the honest elections ballot measure was a bunch of stuff, right? Under the,
But not a funding source.
but not a funding source.
Yeah.
So you got statutory language and then you've got a voter approved.
You've got charter language.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And then a levy essentially.
Mhm.
And what you're pointing to, just for everyone's understanding, is what if we put the funding source in the charter amendment itself? If we amended the charter and had a funding source protected in there, that is, does give a lot more stability to the program's finances for sure. So, but does it violate a single subject rule? That's something I have to run by the attorneys. So new taxes and fees. Some programs are funded by increased penalties for ethics and campaign finance violations. So, someone, a campaign like takes an illegal donation, pays a penalty, part of that penalty goes to fund the program in the future. Or there's an ethics violation that like, a lobby firm or, an elected official may pay, and that goes to fund, this kind of campaign finance reform effort. That is an option. I would say I would have to check on the
$1 million a year,
what?
not $1 million a year.
It's a question about whether it's enough, but I just want to present you the options. But yeah, it might not be enough. Some programs use a tax checkoff, and like Minnesota uses this, the presidential program uses this too. Voters can, or not voters, anyone who pays taxes can just check off whether or not they want to donate $5. That way it's totally optional, and it doesn't cost the program a lot of money to have that in. And also like it doesn't add an
How much
additional
does that
financial
raise?
burden. What did you say, Felisa?
How much does those programs actually raise?
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin though, is that the rates of participation in tax checkoffs have been declining. And however, that analysis is done usually on a county or country or state or countrywide level. And I think it doesn't always account for partisanship. So, for instance, Minnesota does it, but Minnesota has like deeply conservative communities and deeply liberal communities. So do each of them pay a different level, or offer to check off the boxes a little bit differently? And how would that map onto the county? So I asked the Minnesota Public Financing Program whether or not they had that kind of data about rates of participation just for Minneapolis, because I think that would more closely map on to Multnomah County than all of Minnesota does too. I don't have an answer for them yet, but I hope to have one for you.
And if we were to do that, or even like add it as one of, a variety of funding tools, that is not that difficult to do, to add it only to Multnomah County taxpayers' bill in their long list of charitable checkoff options.
That is very
A
dependent.
with a question mark.
Yeah. That's very much a question of the logistics of putting on like what H&R Block and these other tax vendors be one to put on a tax checkoff like that. That's an open question too. So it is an option, but it does come with the open question. The state of Connecticut funds its program by selling unused property. So if we have an asset that we could sell off, that could obviously be an option too. But I have to run that by the budget office.
I believe all of our unclaimed property goes into the state school fund.
Oh, does it really? Well, I meant just like as an example, if there are other assets the county has that it could like generate revenue from. I doubt it, but I'd have to run that by them.
It also is a really long time before you get to unclaimed property
Yeah.
in the state of Oregon. I think it's close to 20 years.
What is there anything that kind of looks like it's off the table for you all immediately, or anything you really want me to dig in on?
I mean, I would really like to, I don't know if it's politically feasible, but I'd really like to know how much you could raise over time with, I guess, a property tax, not an income tax, not in this region. Yeah, I guess a property tax.
I mean, I guess I think about more narrowly targeted taxes. On like PSEF, for example, it's a fairly small number of taxpayers who pay
Mm-hmm.
PSEF, generates a massive amount of money. I think I was joking around after the meeting last time. Can we tax the TV stations for political advertising? I don't even know if it's possible, but like,
For streaming services or like all the over the top. Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah. Could you?
so all the millions that were spent on congressional campaign TV ads, 26 million alone in the 5th district race, all of it running through Multnomah County because all the TV stations are here. Even they're
I don't think you can, because I
You
think
probably
that
can't, but I would want to know that. Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, they also give the candidate rates. So
And I'm sorry, were you asking, what was your question about the property taxes? I just want to make sure I'm getting it succinctly.
I mean, it's really like, what could any of these revenue sources reasonably raise compared to what we are asking, what we would be asking the board to allocate general fund dollars to?
I guess the other question I would have with the property tax, because right now, and I think this is the real like problem with that idea is taxes specifically in Multnomah County are not even remotely popular. Good luck getting a new tax passed in Multnomah County right now. I mean, that's the political temperature is like 70+% people would be adamantly opposed to something of that nature. So, even getting it on the ballot could be challenging.
Right.
So I mean,
We're gonna
that
tax
would
your
be,
property and give it
that
to
would be
candidates.
really a shame if we relied that as our main funding mechanism. And then we didn't have that in place when it actually came time to make it start. Right?
Yeah.
That would be my biggest concern with that. Cause Metro's afraid to run, their extended homeless services
that
tax
they
because they just don't believe it.
Much less welfare for politicians.
Is
Yeah. Yeah.
PSEF a corporate activities tax? What's the clean energy fund? There's as a
It's
corporate
corporate.
tax.
It's like certain
Billion,
percentage.
Yeah.
companies that do $1 billion of business in Oregon. Not me.
Let's look at that as a revenue source. I mean, I think we should have all options on the table and see how much they could raise and if they are stable over time, and then just so then we can make an informed choice.
Well, and then a reasonable question is which of those revenue raising options would be required to go through the voters, and which ones the county board could just pass, if any? I don't know the answer to that.
Good question.
Yeah.
tax TV stations.
I love that idea, by the way. I think that's phenomenal.
Interesting.
I guess I would hesitate to fall on the increased penalties options.
Yeah.
I think that's a really slippery slope into punishing first-time candidates who just make honest mistakes
Agreed.
as a way to fund the program. So I just want to say that I would hesitate going that route.
I don't think it could raise, I'm sure, just trying to think, I mean, we all have paid attention to, the different violations that have been made public, and none of them have raised any significant
Yeah.
amount of dollars.
It doesn't mean that the money that is like the penalties that do occur. I'm not saying that that money shouldn't go back into the fund. I think that could be an option for
Well, and right now,
some money, but I don't think we should increase penalties just as a route to get funding.
Yeah.
the penalties now are all done by the Secretary of State and go to the state, right? There's no city. level
No.
penalties.
No, Multnomah
The
County
city
has
that-
their own.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yeah, the city and the county have their own penalties that you have to pay to the city and the county.
Which are
Mhm.
not insignificant, the counties, after your first slap on the wrist.
Mhm.
Neither are the cities. The cities are very significant.
Yeah, okay. Well, sounds like we're, thinking maybe we want to learn more about the options we have available. Definitely intrigued by, maybe like does a funding formula, how does that sound to people in general too? We haven't really talked about that.
So first of all, I don't think unclaimed property is like really a viable path to go down.
Mhm.
No.
So
Yeah,
I think you should just take it off the list.
Yeah, and to be clear, I was just like, I'm trying to present the universe of options to you all.
I do like the idea of a funding formula. The question would be, what is that formula? Maybe it's getting to Felicia's question about dollars per registered voter or dollars per votes to the last election. Since that would then at least be predictable. And if the county grows, it would grow the amount of money by formula.
Yeah.
If this thing does a good job of getting more people to vote, if it's based on the number of voters who turn out, I'd want to regularize it across presidential, non-presidential years, right? So over a 4-year or 8-year horizon.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be interested in seeing, because I'm not too familiar with budgets and formulas and all that. So I'd be interested in seeing like examples of other formulas, whether that's in a matching system or not, just for my own benefit.
Yeah.
And my only tweak to if we did it by turnout, we're actually kind of rewarding the districts who have higher turnout when the reverse should be true, right? And so if,
Would do it.
however we can balance those scales to where, just thinking about the different county commission districts, if we're doing it per registered voter, maybe we just do it by registered voter as opposed to turnout. Or maybe it's, if we're trying to increase turnout, again, what are our shared values? If we're trying to increase engagement and increase turnout, do we weight that in terms of, does that
I actually wouldn't set per district budgets.
just
I
vote
would say,
across
Yeah,
the
the
board?
whole county,
Yep,
and
okay.
it's, $4
Yeah.
a voter across the entire county, and then how it gets allocated is based on how people qualify and run and all that stuff. I wouldn't.
So, but by that rationale, then both the sheriff, the auditor, and the county chair would all be eligible for the same amount of matching dollars.
necessarily.
Not necessarily.
We're talking
You
about-
could- you
we're
could
talking about defining
set
a
higher,
budget.
yeah. That would just give you your overall.
Okay, so a budget where the formula is based on voters, but it could be very specific per race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
Sheriff could get 2 pieces of pie and
Yeah.
the sheriff gets an 8th piece of pie.
Yeah. Or you could have, you have to be careful because we are thinking about simplicity here as a value.
Mhm.
And I think if you have, every the District 1 race is going to have this much in matching funds
Yeah.
versus the district,
Yeah.
that gets complicated.
Yeah.
And it gets difficult to educate candidates on. But certainly, I'm sure some programs do just have a general formula. They bring all the money in one pot and then they distribute it based on what we talked about before
Mhm.
with the need of the races too.
Yeah, I think we're looking at a funding formula for the entire budget. of the
Yeah.
Program, not the pieces of it.
Okay.
So I like that just for the ease of simplicity, frankly, I do like a formula of the number of registered voters. So you're not trying to do math based on the last 8 years of an election and turnout and, right, and then do you count the undervote or do you not count the undervote, et cetera, like the cost per registered, it's $20 or whatever per registered voter countywide, period. And then figuring out the distribution formula is a different set, but like the formula for the funding is that, and then it has an inflationary value. So we start at $20 per registered voter in the county, and it's tied to inflation, and that number should go up every year with inflation.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm
That's-
just making up that $20 number. I don't know what the actual number is, but just for.
I think, and thank you, Felisa, for that. So I think one other benefit of a funding formula is it does provide some independence for the program. And it actually, like, I think when city councilors in Portland were making decisions around funding of the program, a lot of them were trying to do the very best they could. I'm not trying to like cast aspersions on anyone, but it does have like a political pall that hangs over it. And like, are they making this decision just because they, don't want anyone to compete against them, or, how they're thinking about their next race more than like the needs of the public? So a funding formula allows for like that simplicity, but it also kind of like removes the politics from the situation as well, too.
Mhm.
And so that's another benefit of that.
Yeah, I think
Okay. Well, that is great. That's super helpful. I can look into all those questions. Well, we are definitely over time. We have 15 minutes left, and they do kind of come and kick us out. So I think we don't have enough time to do the distribution methods presentation. And if I ran through it, it wouldn't give it justice because it's a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. So definitely take the presentation home with you, and we'll go into it in greater depth later. But if we want, one of the other items on the agenda was discussing the constraints that the current charter language has. And then what does this advisory committee want to do about that? I think we could at least like have some initial conversation about that. Do you all want to talk about that right now?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. So we'll move the distribution methods to the next time we all meet, but definitely please do review that in your own time. Well, so I share with you the charter language, and I think I'm gonna just pull it up here on my own screen. So Multnomah County voters passed a charter amendment in 2016, and that it came into effect when a judge ruled, that it could be implemented in the last few years. It has many components, some of which are law now and some which are not. So the contribution limits is the law, and like that is, pretty clearly enforced. And I could talk about what that means in a second. There are expenditure limits in the charter language too, which means how much can organizations spend overall, and it applies it to independent groups. So it says independent groups cannot spend more than X amount. That was struck down. So that is not part of the law because that violates Citizens United.
Yep.
So, and then there's also a disclosure piece, like, donors who give this amount to candidates have to be listed by like, paid for by on the campaign ads. We could talk about that if you want, but that's not really the purview of like what we're doing here. If you all want to add more disclosure requirements on, you certainly can. If that's where the committee wants to go. But I want to just focus on the contribution limits because that's really what's like a core, component of the conversations we're having. So the city of Portland has a carve out because it has its own charter limits in place. And the city of Portland has a charter that says candidates cannot take this amount, much more than this amount, they run for office. But if candidates run under public financing, they don't have to worry about those rules. And so what that means is the public financing program at the city can kind of build the rules as it wants. It can like set its own contribution limits for in-kind donations, organizations, individuals, etc. We do not have that carve out from Multnomah County. So what that means is if candidates sign up for the public matching program, they could still be, we cannot set certain rules. They might have to still be running under these rules. And the reason I kind of pause on that one is because there is some question about whether or not can we set lower limits than what the county has. So the county, for instance, has a limit of $603 per donor. That's how much a donor can give to a candidate. It does sound like we have the ability to go lower than that if you want to set a $350 contribution limit, which would link us up with what the city has. I know that is a value for people is how synced up are we to the city rules. So you can likely go lower, but you cannot go higher. So we can't set a contribution limit higher than 603. There is an exception for public programs. So like the matching funds that we give out is accepted from the limits. But unfortunately, we are still, I shouldn't say unfortunately, like it is a constriction that the program has that it cannot set contribution limits higher than the charter.
Without a charter amendment.
Without a charter amendment. Yes, exactly. So, and that impacts a lot of different races. And so like, certainly like donors giving individuals, but also like organizations who want to give in-kind donations, usually that has to be a lot higher than 603 to have impact. So the city organizations can give up to like $10,000 per organization. And that allows candidates to like, get office space or, bring a staffer on board or maybe like build a website. So in-kind donation limits are a lot higher at the city for that reason. But we cannot make them higher than 603. We cannot make loans higher than 603 either. The city allows for loans up to $5,000. We can't do that. And same with organizational donors too. Organizations are allowed to give to candidates if they set up a PAC, but they are limited to 603. There is an exception for small donor organizations. These groups can give unlimited amounts of money, but the definition is very tight. You're only a small donor committee if your donors give you $115 or less per year. So if like 20 donors get together and give you $115, you're a small donor committee. And then you'd be allowed to give unlimited amount of money. The problem is a lot of community-based organizations have donors who give more than that. And so it does like limit a lot of community-based organizations from being small donor committees too. So the point is that the charter is in place. It applies to us. We cannot make limits larger than what the charter does, but we can do smaller than the charter. And so I just want to give you all the lay of the land before we move
So can
on.
I just,
Yeah, go ahead,
so this
Lisa.
is a super clarifying question.
Hmm?
So if we keep the limit at, the limit is at the 600 and I forget what it is, $1 right now. But if you join the matching program, then we'll figure out a match to that every $601 you raise.
Yeah, that's up to you all. Some matching programs, allow, like the city of Portland has $350 limit, but they only match up to $20. And so you can certainly
Yeah.
set a different matching limit than the overall contribution limit if you wanted to.
And when folks have a matching program, usually, I'm saying this as a question, the limits are smaller than the limits if you weren't in the matching program.
Yes, that is
Really?
very common. It's not universal, but that is the most common. Like
Not in
methodology.
Portland.
What did you say?
Not in Portland.
In Portland, yeah.
In Portland, it was because in last year's cycle, the contribution limit was $579, but the small general elections had a limit of $350.
350, yeah.
Right, sorry. The question that we had in the limit subcommittee that I think we'd asked you was what's the limit in the charter on self-financing, and is that in place? Is that the law or has that been rejected?
I still have to get an answer to you on that one. I do have that like listed on my things to ask. So
Aren't there constitutional issues around self-financing?
Yeah, I think the self-financing limit in the charter
like-
is not legal.
Yeah, same with the IE. I think both of those are
Yeah.
not enforceable.
That was the question.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, thank you for reminding me. So in the reason that we're talking about this, I wanted to make sure you're all caught up to speed on it, but in the in-kind contribution subcommittee meeting that happened last week, there was a discussion about would it be valuable for the IAC to make include in its recommendation a charter amendment to allow for a lot more flexibility for a program like this, or like link it, or a charter amendment to like link it up to another program too. Is a charter amendment recommendation something that you all want to discuss more? Is the question at hand.
I, for one, would want to discuss it more. But Marshall and I were talking about in the limits subcommittee of 2, was that there might be some value in syncing the county's limit with the state limit, which has now just been synced to the federal limit, currently $3,300. For those candidates who want to raise at that level, but then have obviously a matching program that really aggressively supports, grassroots candidates that can then catch up to that, right? I think if you're able to raise the private funding limit dramatically, then at the same time, you can then have a very generous matching program at the other end, and then the candidates can choose their own adventure. You want to go this way or you can go that way. You might also include in that, well, the limit's $3,300, but like the city, I just learned, you'd say if you want to participate in the matching, you got to drop yourself to 350 or whatever the case number would be, right? So again, it's a choose your own adventure for the candidates.
So I'm hearing some interest in talking about charter amendment recommendation a little bit more. Yeah, Marshall?
Yeah, and I agree on the charter amendments. I mean, the big things that I see that need some amendments are the in-kind contributions for sure. I think both the city of Portland and the county, that they missed the mark on really what real in-kind donations are and what most organizations do when they do an in-kind donation. And what that leads to is just independent expenditures, which are really one of the things we're trying to avoid in this whole process. And then secondly, the second thing that I would look at is what constitutes that small donor committee and lining that up, whether the answer is you look at, the state limits or lining it up with the city or trying to make things so that they make sense, but the arbitrary number of $100 makes you a small donor committee just doesn't make any sense to me. There's no reasoning behind that number, right?
The small donor
The
number.
small donor committee is actually preempted by the state, Marshall, to your point. So when the state limits go into effect, the state preempts Multnomah County limits.
Oh, Felicia, did you get that opinion back? From the
I got that, but I didn't get the second question yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, okay. So sound like we generally have interest in talking about this more as a recommendation.
I certainly do.
Yeah. What about you three? How do you feel about this? I want to make sure everyone's like really dialed in on this.
I don't know much.
Yeah, no, so I'm interested in learning more about pretty much anything that we can to ensure that this is like the best program that it can be. I mean, within reason, obviously.
I do think one challenge here is we're going to have to develop a system, right, that assumes no charter amendment and then make a recommendation to the county board that says, and we think this should be a charter amendment. And if we do that and it passes, then this is what the system looks like, right? Because
Yeah, we need
we got to be done with our
plan B.
program before there's an election to pass a charter amendment. So that's the challenge.
So to that line of thinking and with what Felicia just said, can we have a list of what the state change is going to do to this program specifically? Because really we should start laying that groundwork now. If in 2 years we're going to be on a new program regardless, we probably shouldn't build something that's going to be torn down in 2 years. I mean, just let's get us to where we need to be in 2 years as opposed to reinventing the wheel.
Totally. Okay.
I think the small donor is the only thing.
Yeah, and I don't
The
know
rest
the
of
answer to that.
both Multnomah County and the city of Portland are brand parented in.
So there was a
Yeah.
question, I think, about whether a state law could override the county charter.
It can.
The state law can override the
can.
county.
So the legislature could like preempt all of this conversation
Right.
if they
Legislature
choose
could
to.
just raise the limits
Yeah.
of the county to the state level.
I mean, the legislature could do that. I feel like that's a discussion to have. If we wanted to have that discussion, recommendation that would have to go to the legislature.
Yeah.
But yes, they could do that.
Very soon.
Mhm.
Well, in the final like 2 minutes before we are exited from this room, do you all? I think that so the in-kind. I don't want to speak for you all too much, but the in-kind contribution subcommittee kind of held off on discussing in-kind contributions more, just because of that restriction, like preempted a lot of conversations. But they did keep themselves open to like meeting again if the full IAC wanted to discuss or wanted to have a subcommittee focus on this issue. And of course, the subcommittee would get into granular detail about it, but like would be in constant communication with the full IAC, so everyone has a chance to participate in the conversation. But I think that the question for you all is, would you rather have this discussion at the full IAC level, or do you all want to have a subcommittee that focuses on like a charter amendment recommendation?
I would prefer to have the conversation at the full IAC level about the changes that come up from the subcommittees based on what they would recommend. If the subcommittees understand that there's a charter amendment conversation that's happening, what are their recommendations? And then I feel like we can get those all together and have a conversation whether or not we should move forward with a charter amendment or not.
Okay.
I agree. I mean, I don't think Marshall and I made any decisions in our limit subcommittee, but we, I think, had a real clear sense that neither of us think that the limit should be lower than the 603.
Certainly not.
We want to have a conversation about going higher if there were a charter amendment or a state law override.
Ditto to what Felisa said. So that would mean that the in-kind committee would reconvene. We'd come up with a recommendation for if and when there were a charter amendment, this is what we would recommend the in-kind be. I would also, I mean, if we are going to contemplate referring something to voters, I would really want us to look at Multnomah County's charter as it relates to campaign finance reform compared to the city of Portland, compared to the states, and see where we can, to every degree possible, come up with as much synergy. I mean, if we're going to go out to voters, we might as well, including disclosure, which is the bane of my existence. And some days I want to put my head down every time I try to do the disclosure stuff.
And it's done.
It's well-intentioned. I will just be generous and say that. So
I'd like
just
to take this opportunity to say that I personally did not pay for all of those ads during the last election cycle. For the record, I personally did not pay for this.
I mean, the way that was written, there were times where it was like, we have, one of my clients had to say paid for by SCIU when it wasn't,
yeah,
because the window goes back
Yeah.
into the previous election cycle.
I also would like to point out that's true, and we did not pay for all of those ads. And I personally, as Felisa Hagen students,
as the major donor.
Mine might be
That's in the
safe.
public record.
So just for order of operations, sounds like there is interest in a subcommittee taking this on, but Felisa, you're saying that like you would want to hear back from the full IAC about how their recommendations are impacted by charter amendment. Is that right?
No, I'm sorry. I feel like I think that the full IAC should hear from the subcommittees. Like the subcommittee should come forward and say, we think there should be a charter amendment on these topics for these reasons. Each of the subcommittees should bring that to the full IAC. And then the full IAC should have a discussion based on these recommendations from the subcommittees about what we need to have happen in charter change. Should we move forward with the charter change or not?
I see. So subcommittees each bring forward their recommendations or suggestions about what they would, what policies would it be, what they would want to see if there were like what charter was amended, and then the full IAC goes from there. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm capturing that. Okay. For the in-kind contribution subcommittee members here, which James isn't here, but Becca and Felisa are, do you want to hold the time on that we have already set aside for your next meeting And do you want to like start to talk about the charter amendment? We might not have the might not have like all the recommendations yet. I think it might take some time for all the other subcommittees to report those out. But I don't want to like create a lag in the conversation too. So does a subcommittee still want to meet at least and like kind of keep the ball rolling on the charter amendment language, even if we don't have like, as we're collecting the recommendations from everyone else?
I would, if it works for other folks. And what would be helpful, I mean, I'm happy to do it on my own, but if you have the opportunity, if you could put in one place what the in-kind statutory changes are from 4024 and what the in-kind limits or opportunities are for the city of Portland, so we can look at both of those
Okay.
when we meet.
That would be very helpful across the board, frankly, like for all the
True.
subcommittees to have, that is like, here are the limits on the, here are the across the 4024, the city of Portland, Multnomah County. Here's the in-kind across the board. Here's the, I'm trying to think of the other big components, the small donor committee component, the spend, the disclosure across the board, so that we can see in comparison. Because if we're trying to get to simplicity, that comparison is actually really important,
Sure.
so that we're not causing more confusion, in my opinion.
Okay. Okay, that's super helpful. All right. Well, I think we have marching orders going forward. We will do methods of distribution next time. I would like to give a presentation to you all about like kind of the legal landscape that we have. And maybe bring someone from the county attorney's office to answer specific questions that I cannot. But that sounds good. And are there any final thoughts, questions, anything you all want me to work on in the meantime? Besides what
To
we
say
talked
that
about?
in our limits subcommittee, we should also be talking about charter amendment as well.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, you all have to vote on an adjournment. So, and then you have to do a roll call individually saying your name and then like,
I move to adjourn.
I second.
I second.
okay.
Kari Chisholm, aye.
Becca, you are below I.
Long Nguyen, aye.
That's real check. I.
Marsha McGrady, aye.
Lisa Higgins, aye.
All right. Thank you all.
Adjourned.
I love these unanimous votes.
Right.
Love it.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah, good night.
Thanks for these amazing charts.
Yeah, definitely.
On the news here.